It wouldn't be the first time a high-profile investigation changed the rules. When Brian Koberger was identified as a suspect in the Idaho student murders, investigative genetic genealogy played a crucial role in moving from unknown perpetrator to named suspect in a matter of weeks. Experts believe that without that rapid identification, more lives could have been at risk. The same technology was considered in other nationally significant cases, including attempted assassination investigations where the need to identify a suspect immediately overrides nearly every other concern. In those moments, when public safety hangs in the balance, the usual barriers start to crumble, and the Nancy Guthrie case carries that same weight, that same urgency, that same potential to force a reckoning between privacy and justice. For weeks after the initial incident, the case seemed to fade from public view. No arrests were announced. No major developments made headlines. The silence felt heavy. The kind of quiet that settles over an investigation when leads dry up and momentum stalls. To those watching from the outside, it appeared the perpetrator had slipped through the cracks, vanishing into anonymity, while a family waited for answers that might never come. But investigative journalist Brian Entin, known for his tenacious coverage of complex criminal cases, wasn't ready to let this story disappear. Instead of moving on to the next headline, he made a decision that would prove critical. He went back, not for a routine follow-up, not to repeat what everyone already knew, but because something about the case felt unresolved in a way that demanded closer examination. He returned to the physical location where the crime occurred, standing on the same street, looking at the same house, trying to understand not just what happened, but how it could have unfolded the way it did. If you appreciate deep-dive investigations that go beyond the headlines, that look at cases from angles others miss, then you're in the right place. This is True Crime Vic, where we examine the details that matter, the questions that linger, and the evidence that doesn't always make it into the evening news. If this kind of thorough analysis is what you're looking for, take a moment right now to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because we're just getting started with this investigation, and what comes next might change everything we think we know about this case. When Entin returned to the scene, he approached the case differently than most. He wasn't looking for the obvious, the kind of evidence that generates immediate press conferences or dramatic announcements. He was searching for something quieter, something that exists in the spaces between official statements and public knowledge. Because in cases like this, the truth often hides not in what you can clearly see, but in what feels slightly wrong, in the details that don't quite align when you slow down and really examine them. Standing there in person, Entin did something most people never do when following a case from a distance. He walked through the timeline step by step, moment by moment, trying to visualize how someone could have moved through that space, at that hour, accomplishing what was done without being detected. And that's when the questions started to surface. On paper, the timeline looked structured and straightforward. There was a suspected window of time, a general sequence of events, a basic understanding of movement patterns. But when you actually stand in the physical location and imagine someone navigating that environment in darkness, the timeline starts to feel less certain. How long would it actually take for someone to approach the property, interact with security cameras, control whatever situation unfolded inside, and then leave the area without being seen or heard by neighbors? Not in theory, but in reality, accounting for all the small variables that don't show up in written reports. Real life doesn't move like a script. People hesitate. Things take longer than expected. Noises happen that weren't planned for. Circumstances shift in unpredictable ways. Yet in this case, everything seemed to unfold with unusual smoothness, with a level of control that suggested something more than luck or impulse. That observation caught Entin's attention. Not the presence of chaos, but the absence of it. Not signs of panic or desperation, but evidence of purpose and planning. According to his analysis of the available information, the person responsible didn't simply show up and react to circumstances as they developed. They moved through the sequence of events, as if they understood exactly where to go, what to do, and when to do it. That kind of confidence, that kind of precision, raises a disturbing possibility. What if this wasn't the first time that person had been in that location? What if familiarity guided their movements instead of guesswork? Because there's a fundamental difference between someone who's improvising and someone who's executing a plan. A stranger guesses. A stranger moves cautiously, testing each step, reacting to surprises. A planner knows. A planner moves with certainty because they've already mapped out the territory in their mind, or perhaps even in person during earlier reconnaissance. Entin began examining patterns, not just from the night of the incident, but from the days and possibly weeks leading up to it. If this was a planned event, then the preparation didn't begin at 2:30 in the morning. It started much earlier, in the form of observation, surveillance, the patient gathering of information that would later inform every decision made during the crime itself. And that's where the investigation starts to expand outward, backward in time, looking for evidence that someone had been watching, learning, preparing. There have been subtle indications, patterns that didn't seem significant at the time, but take on new meaning when viewed through the lens of deliberate planning. To move the way this person moved, to act with the confidence they displayed, you would need specific knowledge. You would need to understand the layout of the property and surrounding area. You would need to know the timing of routines, the moments when activity was high and when everything went quiet. You would need to be aware of camera placements, lighting conditions, potential witness sightlines from neighboring homes. That kind of detailed awareness doesn't come from casual observation or lucky guessing. It comes from sustained attention, from watching over time, from building a mental map of how that location functions throughout the day and night. According to Entin's analysis, that observation might have been happening for an extended period before the incident occurred. Days or even weeks of quiet surveillance that nobody recognized as threatening at the time. But here's what makes this theory both compelling and unsettling. If someone was watching for that long, there's a strong possibility they were seen, not clearly enough to raise immediate alarm. Not in a way that felt overtly suspicious, but perhaps just enough to register in the background of daily life. A vehicle that passed by more frequently than made sense for a non-resident. A figure that appeared in the area multiple times, without obvious purpose. A presence that didn't quite belong, but didn't stand out enough to warrant calling the police. These are the kinds of details that don't make it into official reports, because at the time, they seemed like nothing. But they linger in memory, and once investigators start asking the right questions, witnesses sometimes remember things they didn't realize were important. This is exactly the kind of detail that journalists like Brian Entin excel at uncovering. Because while official investigations necessarily focus on hard evidence that can be used in court, investigative reporters can explore the softer edges of a case, the human observations and behavioral patterns that might not prove anything in a legal sense, but can point investigators in productive directions. From that perspective, something about this case feels staged, not in the sense of being fabricated or theatrical, but staged in terms of execution, controlled, managed, almost choreographed, to minimize risk and maximize efficiency. But that level of control creates its own vulnerability, because the more precisely you plan something, the more you depend on everything going exactly right. Precision leaves less room for improvisation, less tolerance for unexpected variables, which means that if something did go wrong, if some element didn't unfold according to plan, it would stand out as an anomaly in an otherwise controlled sequence. And that's exactly what Entin believes may have occurred. Somewhere in that timeline, there may be a moment that doesn't quite fit, a movement that seems inconsistent with the rest of the pattern, a gap that shouldn't exist if everything went according to plan. It might seem small at first glance, easy to overlook in the broader narrative of events, but in investigations like this, the smallest inconsistency can unravel an entire carefully constructed facade, because it only takes one mistake, one moment where the plan breaks down, one instant where the perpetrator reveals something they didn't intend to reveal, for the truth to start showing through. According to what's emerging from deeper analysis of the case, that moment may already be there, embedded in the timeline, visible to anyone who knows what to look for and how to interpret it. The question is whether investigators have identified it yet, or whether they're holding that information close while they pursue leads the public isn't aware of. Because if Brian Entin is correct in his assessment, this case was never as clean and straightforward as it initially appeared. It only looked that way because no one had examined it from this particular angle, not as a random series of events, but as a sequence of deliberate decisions. And when you start asking why those specific decisions were made instead of other possible choices, you begin to see intention behind the actions. And intention, no matter how carefully concealed, always leaves some kind of trail. Even if that trail is subtle, even if it takes time and expertise to follow, even if it requires looking at the same evidence from multiple different perspectives, it exists, which means whoever carried out this crime may have already revealed more than they realize, may have left clues they don't even know they left, simply because perfect execution of something this complex is nearly impossible. They just didn't anticipate that someone like Brian Entin would return to the case and start examining it through a different lens, asking different questions, looking for the gaps between what should have happened and what actually did. Because once you stop asking what happened and start asking how it was accomplished, the entire story begins to shift. And that shift is exactly where this investigation is heading, toward a deeper understanding not just of the events themselves, but of the planning, preparation, and potential mistakes that made those events possible. If the timeline contains flaws, then everything built on that timeline might be flawed as well. And if that's true, then the real story of what happened that night, the complete story with all its complexities and contradictions, hasn't been fully told yet. When Entin dug deeper into the technical aspects of the case, he shifted his focus from people and motives to something more objective and potentially more revealing: the cameras. Not just the primary camera that everyone knew about, not just the obvious security system, but every possible recording device that might have captured some fragment of movement that night. Doorbell cameras on neighboring houses, street-level surveillance systems, security cameras from properties down the block, even traffic cameras positioned at intersections miles away that might have recorded vehicles entering or leaving the area. Because in the modern world, especially in residential neighborhoods, it's increasingly difficult to move through any space without being recorded by something. And yet whoever planned and executed this crime clearly believed they could control what was captured, or at least prevent it from being useful for identification purposes. That belief alone reveals something important about the perpetrator's mindset. It indicates confidence, not the panicked actions of someone operating on pure impulse, but the calculated approach of someone who had thought about surveillance and believed they had a solution. Approaching a home in darkness and attempting to interfere with a security camera isn't something you do spontaneously. It's a decision that requires forethought, an awareness that cameras exist and pose a threat, and a plan for neutralizing that threat. And that's exactly what the footage appears to show. A figure, moving with calm deliberation, approaching with clear purpose, rather than hesitation. The moment this person steps into the camera's field of view, there's no visible signs of nervousness or uncertainty, no scanning the environment anxiously, no body language that suggests second thoughts or fear of being caught. Just a direct approach toward the camera itself, followed by an attempt to disable it or block its view. At first consideration, that might seem like a tactically sound decision. If you eliminate the camera, you eliminate the primary source of evidence. But that logic contains a fundamental flaw, because the moment you attempt to disable a camera, you've already been recorded. Everything that happened before you reach the camera, before you interfere with its function, has already been captured, and in many modern systems, already uploaded to cloud storage beyond your ability to erase. And that's where this case takes a particularly interesting turn, because instead of successfully hiding the suspect's identity, that action may have revealed more than intended. According to analysts and observers who have examined the available footage, including insights highlighted by Brian Entin, the way the suspect interacted with the camera is just as revealing as their physical presence. Consider what that interaction tells us. The suspect didn't try to stay out of the camera's field of view. They didn't approach from an angle that would keep them in shadows or beyond the lens's range. They walked directly into frame, closing distance with the camera in a way that actually provided better footage than if they had tried to stay hidden. That behavior suggests one of two possibilities. Either they didn't care about being recorded because they were confident their identity couldn't be traced from the footage, or they didn't fully understand how modern security camera systems work. Both possibilities are significant. If the first is true, it suggests someone who has taken steps to disguise themselves or believes they have no presence in any database that law enforcement could search. If the second is true, it suggests a critical misunderstanding of technology, the kind of gap in knowledge that often becomes a perpetrator's downfall. Someone who truly understands how to avoid surveillance typically stays out of camera range entirely. They maintain distance, move through blind spots, take paths that minimize exposure. But this person closed the distance, walked right up to the lens, presented themselves in full view, even if only briefly. That suggests either supreme confidence or a significant miscalculation about how the system functions, and miscalculations create opportunities for investigators. Now consider the timing element. The suspect appears on camera, approaches, attempts to interfere with the recording device, and then moves out of that particular frame. But there's a window of time after that moment that still needs to be accounted for, because disabling one camera doesn't erase what it already recorded, and it doesn't affect what other cameras in the area might be capturing. So the question becomes, what else was recorded before that interference attempt? What details exist in those frames that might not have seemed important during initial review, but take on new significance when examined more carefully? Because in investigations like this, the first analysis often focuses on the most obvious elements: the suspect's physical presence, the primary action, the key moment of confrontation with the camera. But sometimes the real clue isn't in the center of the frame, where everyone's attention naturally goes. It's in the background, in the peripheral details that don't draw the eye immediately. A reflection in a window, a shadow cast by streetlight that reveals more than the direct image, a passing car whose headlights briefly illuminate something that would otherwise remain hidden, movement in the distance that doesn't align with the timeline as currently understood. These are the details that emerge during second and third viewings, when investigators stop watching the obvious and start examining everything else the camera captured. This is precisely the kind of granular analysis that Brian Entin has built his reputation on. He doesn't just look at what's presented as important. He looks at what's happening around it, in the margins, in the moments before and after the highlighted action. Because every frame of video is a complete snapshot of reality at that instant, and reality contains far more information than any single viewing can absorb. Now expand that concept beyond a single camera. In a residential neighborhood, especially one where security consciousness has increased in recent years, there are usually multiple overlapping fields of view. One house has a doorbell camera facing the street. The neighbor across the way has a driveway camera that captures the same street from a different angle. Someone down the block has a wide-angle system that monitors the entire front of their property. Each camera sees slightly different things, captures slightly different moments, records from a slightly different perspective, which means even if the suspect successfully disabled or avoided the primary camera, they might still appear in secondary footage they didn't know existed or didn't consider significant. And this is where the investigation potentially expands in crucial ways. Because if the perpetrator believed they had neutralized the main threat to their anonymity, they might have relaxed their guard afterward. They might have moved more naturally, spent more time in the area than originally planned, taken a more direct route to their vehicle or exit point. Every one of those decisions creates opportunity. Opportunity for another camera to capture something useful, even if it's not a clear facial image. Movement patterns matter. Direction of travel matters. Timing matters. Because when you start collecting these fragments from multiple sources and aligning them chronologically, a larger picture begins to emerge. And according to what's being explored in the ongoing investigation, there may be more footage available than the public currently knows about, not information that's been publicly released, not details confirmed in official statements, but enough to suggest that the suspect's movements that night might not be as concealed as they believed. That possibility creates mounting pressure, because if multiple cameras captured different fragments of the same sequence, those fragments can potentially be assembled piece by piece, frame by frame, until a coherent path reveals itself where the suspect came from, before arriving at the target location, where they went afterward, how long they remained in the immediate area, whether they made multiple passes before committing to the approach, and perhaps, most critically, whether they returned to the area at any point after the initial incident. All of these questions can potentially be answered through careful analysis of overlapping camera coverage, and that analysis is exactly what investigators and observers, like Brian Entin, are now focused on. This case stands at a critical juncture. What appeared at first to be a situation where the perpetrator successfully avoided identification may actually be a situation where crucial evidence exists, but requires deeper analysis to reveal its full significance. The cameras were watching, multiple cameras from multiple angles, and somewhere in that collected footage may be the detail that breaks this case open. The question is no longer whether evidence exists. The question is whether investigators can extract enough information from that evidence to move from unknown suspect to identified individual. And if DNA evidence exists alongside this video analysis, if genetic genealogy becomes available as a tool, if public pressure continues to build for answers, then this case has all the elements necessary to move from stalled investigation to active prosecution. But that progression depends on connecting the pieces, finding the gaps in the carefully constructed plan, identifying the moment where intention left its trail. Because no matter how controlled the execution appeared, no matter how carefully everything seemed planned, there is always a moment where reality intrudes on planning. Always a detail that doesn't go exactly as anticipated. Always a trace left behind that the perpetrator didn't account for. And when that detail emerges, when investigators and journalists like Brian Entin identify that crucial inconsistency, everything changes. The case that seemed cold becomes active again. The perpetrator who seemed invisible becomes visible. The mystery that appeared unsolvable begins to resolve. We're watching that process unfold right now in real time. And what comes next could redefine not just this case, but how similar cases are approached in the future. If you want to stay informed as this investigation develops, as new information emerges, as the pieces continue to come together, make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Vic. This is only part 1 of our deep dive into the Nancy Guthrie case, and what we uncover in part 2 might be the most significant revelation yet. Hit that subscribe button now, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Because in investigations like this, the next piece of information could be the one that changes everything. The cameras captured more than anyone initially realized. The timeline contains gaps that demand explanation, and somewhere in those gaps lies the truth about what really happened that night. And who is responsible? We're going to find it together. The cameras told one story, but they couldn't tell the complete story, because video footage, no matter how comprehensive, only captures moments. It doesn't capture context, intention, or the days and weeks of behavior that might have led to those moments. And that's where the investigation had to shift direction, away from technology and towards something far less precise, but potentially more revealing: human memory. Brian Entin understood that every camera has a limited field of view, a fixed perspective that sees only what falls within its range. But people see differently. They notice things that don't make logical sense to notice. They feel discomfort without understanding why. They remember details that seemed meaningless at the time, but take on significance later. And in cases like this, those remembered details can matter just as much as recorded evidence, sometimes even more. So Entin did what he does best. He went back to the neighborhood, not to look at houses or retrace timelines, but to talk to people, not just the obvious witnesses, not just those who had already given statements to police, but anyone who might have been present in the area during the relevant time frame. Anyone who was awake late at night, anyone who happened to glance out a window, anyone whose routine might have put them in a position to observe something without realizing its importance. Because in residential areas, especially quiet ones where unusual activity stands out, people notice more than they consciously register. A car parked where it doesn't belong, a figure walking past at an odd hour, a presence that doesn't fit the normal rhythm of the neighborhood. These observations rarely trigger immediate alarm. They're filed away as minor curiosities, odd but not threatening, until something happens. And then those minor curiosities become critical data points. According to Entin's reporting, that's exactly what started emerging when he began having those conversations. Not dramatic revelations, not eyewitness identifications, but a pattern of small discomforts. Subtle observations that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested something important. One neighbor mentioned a vehicle, not with certainty, not with enough detail to provide a make or model, but enough to say it felt unfamiliar. It was parked on the street, not in a driveway. It was there. And then it wasn't. Seen once, possibly twice. Nothing that would normally prompt someone to call the police, or even give it much thought. Just a mental note that something was slightly out of place. Another person described movement near the street during late evening hours. Not a clear sighting. Not someone doing anything obviously suspicious, just a presence that registered as unusual. A moment of noticing someone who didn't seem to belong, followed by the assumption that they were probably a visitor, or a delivery person, or someone with a perfectly reasonable explanation for being there. These kinds of statements don't usually make it into news coverage because they feel too vague, too uncertain to build a story around. But Entin recognized something that often gets overlooked in criminal investigations. Uncertainty is still information. Vagueness doesn't mean irrelevance. When multiple people independently describe feeling that something was slightly off during the same general time frame, even if they can't articulate exactly what triggered that feeling, it stops being coincidence and starts forming a pattern of perception. And perception matters, because criminals don't operate in a vacuum. They move through real environments populated by real people who have instincts, who notice things on a subconscious level even when they're not actively watching for threats. Every action a perpetrator takes is shaped by the risk of being observed. Every decision is influenced by visibility. And the more people Entin spoke with, the clearer one possibility became. Someone may have been in that area longer than the single night when the crime occurred, not just passing through quickly to minimize exposure, but present in the environment over an extended period, observing it, learning its rhythms, understanding when people were alert and when they let their guard down. That possibility changes everything about how we understand this case. Because if the suspect was truly unfamiliar with the location, their behavior would reflect high risk and urgency. Quick action, immediate exit, minimal time spent in the area. But if they were familiar, if they had studied the environment beforehand, then the behavior shifts dramatically. Movement becomes more controlled. Timing becomes more deliberate. Confidence increases, and confidence, while it can make someone more effective in the moment, also leads to mistakes. Because confident people take risks they wouldn't take if they felt vulnerable. They spend more time in dangerous proximity. They make assumptions about what they can get away with, and those assumptions create opportunities for detection. Now, one particular detail stood out among the scattered accounts Entin collected, not because it was dramatic or definitive, but because it appeared in different forms across multiple conversations. The sense that something felt wrong before anything actually happened, not afterward, when fear and retrospection color every memory, but before, during the days or weeks leading up to the incident, when there was no obvious reason to feel uneasy. That temporal detail matters immensely, because it suggests presence, and presence suggests preparation. People don't feel vaguely uncomfortable about their surroundings without some stimulus, however subtle, triggering that response. Maybe it's the same unfamiliar vehicle appearing multiple times. Maybe it's noticing someone in the neighborhood who doesn't interact the way residents typically do. Maybe it's just the subconscious recognition that normal patterns have been disrupted in some small way. Whatever the specific trigger, the fact that multiple people reported this feeling before the crime occurred points toward one uncomfortable conclusion. Someone was there, watching, learning, preparing, and while they may have believed they were blending in successfully, they were leaving impressions on the people around them. Faint impressions, not strong enough to prompt action at the time, but real nonetheless. This is where Brian Entin's approach becomes particularly valuable. He doesn't treat these vague statements as conclusions. He doesn't build theories on top of uncertain foundations. Instead, he treats them as signals, indicators that something exists beneath the surface narrative that hasn't been fully explored yet, something not captured in official timelines or press releases. And as he continued piecing together those signals, a disturbing possibility took shape. What if the suspect didn't just pass through the area on the night of the crime, but had studied it systematically over time, studied routines, studied silence, studied the moments when surveillance was least likely and awareness was lowest? Because crimes that appear clean and controlled on the surface are often built on exactly that kind of preparation. Observation over time, repetition of reconnaissance, gradual accumulation of knowledge that eventually enables decisive action, and repetition, no matter how carefully executed, leaves residue. It creates patterns. A vehicle seen more than once, a figure appearing on different nights, a route that becomes familiar even to those who aren't consciously tracking it. These patterns might not trigger alarm in the moment, but they exist. They're noticed, even if not reported. They're remembered, even if not immediately understood as significant. And once a crime occurs, those scattered observations suddenly have context. They transform from meaningless background details into potential evidence. The investigation begins to take a different shape at this point, because once you start considering the possibility of extended observation, you have to ask fundamentally different questions. Not just what happened on the specific night in question, but who already knew what that night would look like, who understood the patterns well enough to predict when visibility would be lowest, when cameras might not be monitored actively, when the chances of interruption were minimal. That shift is critical because it transforms the case from a random act of violence or opportunistic crime into something far more calculated. Structured behavior. And structured behavior implies intent, planning, purpose. But intent alone doesn't solve anything. It only deepens the mystery in certain ways. Because even if we accept that someone was watching, planning, familiarizing themselves with the environment, there's still one enormous unanswered question hanging over this entire case. Why? Why this person? Why this location? Why this particular night? And that question has no clean answer available to the public right now. No confirmed motive has been released by investigators. No verified connection between the victim and a potential suspect has been established publicly. No official explanation has been offered that ties all these elements together into a coherent narrative. Only fragments exist, scattered pieces of information that don't yet form a complete picture. And fragments are dangerous in criminal cases because they invite interpretation, speculation, theory building that goes beyond what evidence actually supports. Some observers believe this was a targeted crime, that the victim was specifically chosen for reasons not yet understood. Others believe it was opportunistic, that circumstances aligned in a way that enabled someone with harmful intent to act on impulse. Still others believe that key details have been deliberately withheld from public disclosure for investigative reasons, that law enforcement knows more than they're saying, and are holding information close while they pursue leads. None of those theories are confirmed. None can be stated as fact. And Brian Entin is careful about that line. He doesn't replace verified evidence with speculation. He doesn't fill gaps with assumptions. Instead, he highlights what is missing, what remains unexplained, what questions still lack answers. And what is missing in this case is just as important as what is known. There is still no clear public explanation for why this particular individual was chosen. No confirmed prior relationship has been established. No documented history between victim and perpetrator has been released. No definitive motive has been announced by investigators. That absence creates a vacuum. And in criminal investigations, vacuums tend to get filled quickly, filled with theories, with assumptions, with fear. But Entin resists the temptation to fill that space prematurely. Instead, he keeps returning to one central idea that guides his reporting. Someone knows more than what has been said publicly, not necessarily the perpetrator, not necessarily a direct witness to the crime, but someone connected to the timeline, the environment, the sequence of events. Because the more conversations he has, the more he encounters not denial or contradiction, but hesitation. And hesitation tells its own story. If you're finding value in this detailed examination of how investigations develop, how evidence accumulates, how cases move from mystery toward clarity, then True Crime Vic is exactly where you need to be. We don't chase headlines. We don't speculate beyond what evidence supports. We examine cases the way they actually unfold, piece by piece, question by question. If that approach resonates with you, hit that like button right now, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because this case is still developing, and what emerges next could be the detail that finally brings clarity to everything we've been examining. People hesitate when they're unsure about what they know, or how to interpret it. People hesitate when they're afraid of the consequences of speaking. People hesitate when they feel watched, when they worry that coming forward might put them at risk. And that last possibility changes the tone of everything we're discussing. Because if fear is present in a community, if people are holding back information because they're worried about retaliation or exposure or simply becoming more involved than they want to be, then the impact of this crime extends far beyond the immediate victim. It spreads outward, quietly, subtly, creating distance. Distance between what people observed and what they're willing to say. Distance between what they suspect and what they can prove. Distance between their private knowledge and their public statements. And that distance is exactly where truth becomes harder to reach, where investigations slow down, where cases risk going cold, not because evidence doesn't exist, but because access to that evidence is blocked by fear or uncertainty or reluctance to get involved. As Entin continues documenting this case, he's begun recognizing a pattern he's seen before in other investigations. Not silence because nothing is known, but silence because something is understood but remains unspoken. A shared awareness that doesn't translate into shared disclosure. And that's far more unsettling than simple absence of information, because it suggests that the full picture exists, distributed across multiple minds, but those fragments remain intentionally or fearfully separated, which means somewhere in that community, someone probably has the piece of information that could shift this entire investigation. They might not even realize its significance. They might think what they know is too small to matter, too uncertain to report, too risky to reveal. But in cases built on fragments, every piece matters. Every observation, no matter how minor it seems, has potential value. There is still movement in this investigation, though, not in the form of public announcements or official updates or press conferences announcing breakthroughs, but in the background. Small confirmations occurring out of public view, quiet developments that don't make headlines but indicate progress. Unreleased details being reviewed again with fresh perspective. And according to the pattern Entin has observed in his years of covering criminal cases, that kind of quiet activity usually means one thing: something new has been found. But it hasn't been understood fully enough yet to release publicly. Evidence exists that investigators are still working to contextualize, to connect to other elements, to verify before making official statements. And that leads directly into what may be the most critical phase of this entire investigation. Because if the environment was under observation for an extended period, and if people noticed small inconsistencies during that time, and if the timing of the crime itself was more controlled and deliberate than random chance would explain, then the investigation is now moving toward a deeper, more focused question. Not just who was present in that location on that specific night, but who had the ability to be there repeatedly without raising alarm. Who could move through that environment multiple times, observing and learning, without standing out so dramatically that someone called the police. Who possessed the knowledge of the area, the comfort with the environment, the understanding of patterns that would enable the kind of controlled execution that evidence seems to suggest. That question shifts the entire investigative focus, because it's no longer about identifying a stranger who appeared once and vanished. It's about identifying someone who may have been part of the landscape, visible but not noticed, present but not recognized as a threat. And that's a much more complex challenge, but also one that leaves more traces, more opportunities for identification, more points where observation and memory intersect with physical evidence. Now the focus shifts again, away from scattered witness accounts, away from camera footage, away from individual observations, and towards something more fundamental, the structure of the plan itself. Because if this was planned, if preparation occurred over time, if knowledge was gathered systematically, then the execution of the crime should reflect that structure. And according to what's emerging from continued analysis, it does. Every confirmed detail, every timestamp, every camera fragment, every witness account, when aligned chronologically and spatially, begins to form not a random sequence, but something that looks increasingly intentional. Not perfect, because perfect execution is essentially impossible in real-world conditions, but controlled, managed, shaped by prior knowledge rather than improvised in the moment. And control is precisely what separates crimes of opportunity from planned operations. Opportunistic crimes are reactive, chaotic, full of unexpected complications and improvised solutions. Planned crimes are proactive, structured, with contingencies built in and risks minimized through preparation. The evidence in this case increasingly points toward the latter, but even the most carefully controlled plan has one inherent weakness. It must eventually interact with reality, and reality is unpredictable. Variables emerge that can't be anticipated. People behave in ways that don't match expected patterns. Technology functions differently than assumed. Timing shifts in ways that create gaps or overlaps that weren't part of the plan. And those points where planning meets the chaos of actual execution, those are exactly where mistakes happen, where the structure breaks down, where evidence gets left behind that the perpetrator didn't intend to leave. Brian Entin's attention has turned to exactly that concept. Because if everything was planned as carefully as the evidence suggests, then the only place something could go significantly wrong is at that intersection between plan and reality. And according to what he's been able to piece together from various sources, something may have gone wrong, not catastrophically, not in a way that completely derailed the crime, but enough to create inconsistencies, gaps, moments that don't align quite right when examined closely. Investigators have not publicly confirmed a final breakthrough. No arrest has been announced. No suspect has been officially identified by name. No definitive resolution has been released to the media or the public. The case remains officially open, officially under investigation, officially unresolved. But behind the scenes, according to the subtle shifts in how information is being handled and the kinds of questions being asked, something has changed. Certain elements of the case no longer fit together as neatly as they appeared to initially. And when that happens in criminal investigations, it usually indicates one thing. A new interpretation has emerged, not replacing established facts, not contradicting verified evidence, but reorganizing how those facts and that evidence are understood. Seeing the same information from a different angle and recognizing patterns that weren't visible before. And that reorganization is where things become genuinely dangerous for whoever is responsible for this crime. Because small inconsistencies that seemed irrelevant when viewed in isolation start to grow in importance when viewed as part of a larger pattern. A delay that doesn't make sense, given the supposed timeline. A movement captured on camera that doesn't align with where the suspect should have been at that moment, according to the established sequence. A gap in expected timing, where more or less time elapsed than the scenario requires, a sequence of actions that feels slightly off, not wrong enough to be obvious, but irregular enough to notice when examined carefully. Individually, none of these elements would matter. They could be dismissed as normal variation, acceptable margin of error, the difference between theoretical timelines and real-world execution. But together, they form what investigators call pressure points, structural weak spots, where the plan doesn't quite hold together under scrutiny. And pressure points, when identified and exploited, break structure. They reveal what's underneath the controlled surface. Entin's reporting emphasizes this indirectly, not by declaring conclusions he can't verify, not by naming suspects who haven't been charged, but by highlighting what still doesn't make complete sense. What remains unexplained, despite all the evidence gathered. And what doesn't make sense in this case is not the existence of evidence itself, but the gaps between different pieces of evidence. Because in a truly clean timeline, everything connects seamlessly. Everything flows naturally from one moment to the next. But in this case, there are pauses, unexplained transitions, missing clarity between known points in the sequence. And those missing pieces have become the current focus of investigation, because they suggest something critical. Not that the case is unsolvable, not that evidence is insufficient, but that the full picture is not yet visible. And visibility changes everything. Once movement that was hidden becomes visible, behavior can be reconstructed. Once behavior is reconstructed, intent becomes clearer. And once intent is clear, the identity behind it becomes progressively harder to hide. But even now, at this stage of the investigation, there is still no official confirmation of who that identity is. No name has been released. No suspect has been publicly identified. No arrest is imminent as far as public information indicates. Only direction exists. The investigation is moving, quietly but steadily, in a specific direction. And that direction points towards something deeply uncomfortable for whoever is responsible. They may have significantly underestimated how much of their activity was indirectly recorded, not necessarily by one single camera, not necessarily by one observant witness, but by the environment itself. Because modern residential environments remember more than people often realize. Security cameras, doorbell systems, traffic monitors, license plate readers, cell phone location data, credit card transactions. All the digital infrastructure of contemporary life creates what amounts to a silent record of movement, a record that doesn't forget, doesn't get influenced by emotion or fear, doesn't change over time. It simply exists, waiting to be accessed and analyzed. And if Brian Entin's continued investigation and reporting is correct, that silent record may already contain the answer to who is responsible for this crime. It just hasn't been fully assembled yet. The pieces exist in different systems, different databases, different collections of evidence, but they haven't been completely integrated into a single coherent narrative that definitively identifies a perpetrator. And that is where this case currently stands. Not solved, not closed, not resolved with arrests and charges and court proceedings, but moving quietly, moving carefully, moving steadily towards something that may eventually force complete clarity. Because in every investigation like this, in every case that seems impossibly complex at first, there is always a moment when fragments stop being isolated pieces of information and suddenly coalesce into a recognizable picture. When the pattern becomes visible, when the structure reveals itself, when all those scattered observations and evidence points and timeline gaps align in a way that makes everything suddenly make sense. And when that moment arrives, there is no going back to uncertainty, no returning to mystery. Only understanding remains, only the truth, finally visible after being obscured for so long. But until that moment actually comes, until investigators are ready to make official announcements, until evidence has been verified to the standard required for charges and prosecution, this case remains exactly what it is right now. A pattern still coming into focus, a truth that has not yet fully revealed itself, but is getting closer to visibility with each piece of evidence analyzed, each witness interviewed, each timeline gap examined, each surveillance frame reviewed. The work continues, mostly out of public view, mostly in the patient, methodical way that real investigations actually proceed, rather than the dramatic way they're portrayed in entertainment. And somewhere in that ongoing work, in that continued analysis, in that persistent examination of what doesn't quite fit together perfectly, the answer exists. This is True Crime Vic, where we follow cases from beginning to resolution, where we examine evidence as it actually develops rather than speculating beyond what facts support, where we respect both the victims who deserve justice and the process that must be followed to achieve that justice. If you want to stay informed, as this case continues to develop, as new information emerges, as the investigation moves closer to whatever conclusion the evidence ultimately supports, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next update. Because in cases like this, the next piece of information could be the one that finally makes everything clear. The cameras captured more than initially recognized. The witnesses remember more than they first realized. The timeline contains gaps that demand explanation. And somewhere in those gaps, in those memories, in those silent digital records, lies the complete truth about what happened and who is responsible. We'll be here to examine it, carefully and thoroughly, when that truth finally emerges.